Hello, our dear students. I would like to welcome you to this lesson where we are going to continue with our topic, which is nutrition. And in this particular lesson, we are going to look at nutrition in different organisms. We shall look at nutrition in fungi. We shall also look at nutrition in protists, like the amoeba, and then nutrition in insects, in amphibians like frogs and the toads, how do they feed? And then we shall also look at nutrition in birds. So this is a very rich topic. I would actually say that this topic is very nutritious. So you're going to learn a lot of information about how different organisms obtain their food. So you're welcome once again to this topic, and I would like to encourage you to continue staying safe and being at home, following all the guidelines that the government has put in place so that we can be safe from coronavirus. So I want to start with the nutrition in fungi. So I know from your classification you must have covered members of kingdom fungi. Do you know some of them? Well, you know the mushrooms, the bread molds, and many other examples of fungi. So we want to see how these organisms actually feed. How do they obtain their nutrients to support their life processes? So in fungi, the mode of nutrition in fungi is called saprophytism. And then in some books, we call it saprotropism. It just means the same. Saprophytism or saprotropism. And the type of digestion that they employ is extracellular digestion, where digestion takes place outside the cells. So that one is called extracellular. So what is the mode of nutrition? It is saprophytism, and then the type of digestion is extracellular. So members, fungi obtain their nutritional requirements from dead, decomposing organic matter. So the process by which organisms feed on dead and decomposing organic matter is what we have called saprophytic nutrition or saprotrophic nutrition. So the fungi usually, that is how they obtain their food, from dead, decaying what? Matter. So what do they do exactly? So they form a mass of soft, closely woven threads called a mycelium, a combination of the hyphae. So you know these fungi have thread-like structures called the hyphae, and those thread-like structures interweave. They form like a mesh. Yeah, they crisscross each other, forming a large mass. Yes, called the mycelium body. So this mycelium here grows into the dead decomposing matter. Yes, the mycelium grows into the dead decomposing what? Matter. For example, in bread mold, the mycelium grows into the bread. Yeah, you find it growing into the bread. And the hyphae, which forms the mycelium, produces enzymes. It has the capacity to secrete what? Enzymes, which diffuse into the dead decomposing matter, digesting it into soluble products, which are then absorbed or sucked into the body of the fungi, where they are later on assimilated into the cytoplasm and used for life processes. So this kind of nutrition is very interesting. So an organism the mycelium grows into the dead decaying matter, and then the hyphae produces the enzymes, and then those enzymes digest this food externally. But that's what we call extracellular nutrition. And then after digesting it, nutrients, of course, are produced, and those nutrients are then absorbed into the body of the fungus, and then it will be assimilated and used. So that's how the fungi feed. Very interesting there. So let's look at another. I want you to summarize how the fungi feed in a paragraph, and then we proceed to the nutrition in protists. So these protists include the amoebas, the parameciums, the euglenias, the plasmodia, the trypanosoma, and so on. Those are some of the members of kingdom Protoctista. But in this particular lesson, we are going to focus on one of the members, and that is the amoeba. And I know you could have heard about amoeba in our classification, and also in senior one we looked at how the amoeba feeds. You remember that? By engulfing or phagocytosis. Exactly, that's what we are going to look at here. So the mode of nutrition in amoeba is what we call phagocytosis. Phagocytosis. And the type of digestion here is intracellular. Remember in fungi it was extracellular, where digestion takes place outside the cells that produce the enzymes. In this case, digestion takes place inside the cell of an amoeba. So it's called intracellular digestion. So what happens exactly? So what happens is that when the amoeba comes across a food particle, remember amoeba lives always in moist, in waterlogged areas. Usually its food is within the water there. So when it comes across the food particle, it immediately starts moving towards it. Yeah. Of course, you remember one of the reasons why organisms move or why they locomote is to search for food. So when amoeba gets the food particle, it will locomote, it will move towards the food particle. And using its pseudopodia or the false feet, it forms a cup shape, and two ends of the pseudopodia start engulfing or enclosing the food particle, enclosing it with some water in and a small cavity called the food vacuole. So it encloses that food particle, forming what we call the food vacuole. So what happens inside the food vacuole now? Enzymes are then secreted or released from the cytoplasm into the food vacuole. And you know what the enzymes do? These enzymes will break down the food into small soluble particles, which are then absorbed directly into the cytoplasm. So, very interesting also. When you see the food particle, it moves towards it. After moving towards it, it will use its pseudopodia to enclose, to engulf that food particle. After engulfing it, it will form a food vacuole around that food particle, and then enzymes will be released from the cytoplasm. And then those enzymes, you know, of course, what enzymes do. They will facilitate the breakdown of that food particle. After food has been broken down, the nutrients are produced, and those nutrients will be absorbed by the amoeboid cell, and then the waste products will be removed. So that is how the amoeba feeds. You can see from this drawing here, you can see the amoeba there from the first on your left up. The amoeba moves towards the food particle, and as it moves closer to the food particle, it will form a pseudopodia. Those pseudopodia, a cup-shaped structure there, will form. And then in the next drawing, you can see that it has engulfed, it has enclosed that food particle. And then inside that enclosure, a food vacuole will form where enzymes will be secreted, and those enzymes will digest that food. And then the nutrients will be absorbed into the amoeboid cell, and then the waste will be removed. So that kind of feeding is what we call phagocytosis, a type of feeding where an organism engulfs or takes in solid food and then breaks it down to form nutrients, is what we call phagocytosis. And this is the best example in amoeba. I want you to summarize nutrition in amoeba in another paragraph. Then you send me that assignment. Let's proceed to feeding in insects. Of course, you must be knowing some of the insects. They belong to kingdom Animalia, phylum Arthropoda, and class Insecta. And it's one of the greatest classes because they have more numbers than any other class in kingdom Animalia. It's the most popular class, therefore. So, and there are very many insects. So we are going to look at some of them. We are going to group them in the depending on the method in which they feed. And yeah, we shall look at each method, and also we shall see the examples of insects that belong to that particular method. So, but what is general in all of them is that insects carry out extracellular digestion. Yes, they carry out extracellular digestion, just like the fungi. They secrete enzymes from the cells, and then those enzymes will act on food particles outside the cells that produce them. So that's what they do. They feed on a wide variety of foods using varied feeding methods, which may include the following. There are some insects like the houseflies, the bees, the butterflies, which feed on both plant and animal fluids using their specialized mouth parts called the proboscis. That proboscis is used for sucking plant and animal juices. Probably you must have seen the butterflies. Yes, feeding on flowers. They feed on nectar. They have a long proboscis. They insert it into the flower and then they suck the nectar. Then you have seen the housefly. It has a very large proboscis, like a cup-shaped proboscis, like a funnel. It looks like a funnel. And it inserts it into fluid food or feces or dirty food particles, and then it sucks it. So there is that category of insects. Yeah, their work is sucking, and that is how they feed. Interesting. That is how those members feed. And what enables them to do that is that they have specialized mouth parts, which are adapted for that particular purpose. They cannot chew, they cannot pierce, but they just suck. Meaning their food must be fluid. Okay. Then we have another group of insects, like the tsetse flies. You must have heard about tsetse flies. Mosquito, this one you interact with it every day. Aphids, bedbugs. I hope you don't have bedbugs at home. Make sure you fight against them in case you have them on your bed. So we have bedbugs. Now, those members, how do they feed? For this group, they have piercing and sucking mouth parts. So they have mouth parts that can pierce, but also suck. And then there are those that are blood sucking. For example, tsetse flies and mosquitoes and bedbugs. For them, they further have an anticoagulant, which prevents clotting of blood during the feeding process. For example, when a mosquito bites you, immediately it pierces you, it will secrete an anticoagulant. Yes, and that anticoagulant has the same formula, same structure like heparin in humans, in our blood, and that anticoagulant there prevents blood from clotting, hence allowing blood to be liquid, to be sucked continuously until the feeding is completed. So that kind of mechanism is interesting. At the same time, that anticoagulant also has a pain-killing capacity. It prevents you from feeling pain. So you actually feel pain after the feeding has taken place. After the mosquito has sucked your blood, then you feel pain. So sometimes you hit that part thinking that you are killing the mosquito. It has already gone away. Simply because the time it was feeding, you were not feeling the pain. So they have a very special mouth part. Especially mosquitoes have what we call the stylet, which is very sharp, used for piercing and then later on sucking the blood. So we have that category of insects. For them, they have mouth parts for piercing, but also for sucking. Great. Then we have the next one. We have a large number of insects. For example, grasshoppers, cockroaches, ants. You remember the termites, praying mantis. These ones have modified mouth parts for biting and chewing. Those mouth parts are called mandibles. And they feed on solid food like others. They feed on peppers, like cockroaches feed on peppers. Others feed on grass, like grasshoppers, and so on and so forth. So those insects, and even larval stages of like butterflies, the caterpillars also have biting mouth parts and chewing mouth parts. So those ones, they can bite and chew. Those are uh, so we have those categories of insects depending on the way they feed. There are those that their work is to suck, just the sucking mouth parts, the proboscis. There are those whose mouth parts are modified for sucking and piercing. Then there are those whose mouth parts are for biting and chewing. So this kind of arrangement, whereby different insects are modified to feed on different food, is what has made insects the most popular class in kingdom Animalia. It's what has made insects the greatest number. They are more than any other classes, just simply because they are able to feed on different, so they don't compete. the competition is not so stiff because they specialize to feed on different what? Foods. Okay, so let's proceed to, I want you to summarize different methods of feeding in insects, and then you add to the other two assignments, and then you send me. So as we proceed now to feeding in amphibians, of course you know that members of amphibia, they belong to kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, and then class Amphibia. They include the salamanders, the newts, the frogs, the toads. The most common ones in our habitats, in our homes, are the toads and the frogs. So those are the ones we can talk about now. So amphibians carry out extracellular digestion, just like insects and the fungi. Their enzymes are produced by the cells, but those enzymes work outside those cells, probably in the digestive system. Yeah. So they normally feed on food of animal origin. So they are carnivorous, therefore. They feed on other animals, insects and the worms and so on. However, the larval stages of the amphibians, you know, you remember the tadpoles, those tadpoles which are you find in water, black and have tails. Those tadpoles feed on plants. They are vegetarian in nature. For them, they feed on plant material as well. So we now know that amphibians have extracellular digestion, and then the adults are majorly carnivorous, and then the larval stages may be herbivorous. So let's look at how they feed exactly. So they feed on insects, worms, which they trap with their tongues. So they use their tongues for trapping. Amphibians flip out the free end of their long tongue, their long sticky tongue. Their tongues are sticky because they have mucus in them. And those tongues can be spread out at a very high speed and with great accuracy. They rarely miss their prey. This mechanism of adaptation for catching prey, which moves rapidly, so they can catch even insects that are very rapid in their movement because of their tongue being very swiftly flipped out and also having sticky mucus. So sometimes they leap or they hop towards the flying insect or stationary insect and trap it with a wide mouth and then ingest it. Some toads can swallow their victims whole and alive. So when they see an insect or potential food, they hop. You see how the frogs move? They jump. That is what we call hopping towards that, if that food. Then as they move closer to it, they throw their tongue into the insect very fast and accurately without missing. Capture it and then they swallow it. Sometimes they even swallow the food when it is still alive. As the insect is still kicking, it's already in the stomach. So there is no wasting time in this business. These amphibians feed like that. They use their tongue for feeding. Then they swallow and then they digest it. Okay, I want you to summarize also feeding in amphibians as we now move to feeding or nutrition in birds. So birds feed on different types of food. There are birds which feed on seeds. You know them very well. There are those that feed on insects. You are aware about them. There are some that feed on fish. There are those that feed on rodents like rats and so on. And then there are other birds that feed on dead decaying mammals. Yeah, they're scavengers like the vultures. So those are some of the birds. Others, of course, feed on fruits and so on. So the beaks and the feet of the birds are adapted to the kinds of food they eat. Yeah, and the habits in which they obtain this food. So for them to feed on this food, there must be an adaptation within their bodies that enables them to capture this food and feed on it. For example, those that feed on fruits, on flesh, their beaks are different depending on what they feed on. And even their toes and their feet are different. We are going to look at each one of them. There are those that we call the flesh-eating birds, sometimes popularly known as the birds of prey. Yeah, in other words, they are carnivorous birds. These are specialized in feeding flesh. They use flesh as their food. They are flesh eaters. We are talking about the eagles. We are talking about the hawks, the owls, the vultures, and so on. Those ones are flesh-eating birds. They don't have business with the seeds and so on. Majorly they feed on what? Flesh. So what do they have? They have strong curved hooked toes for killing the prey and tearing the flesh. So when you look at their toes, very sharp toes or claws for capturing the prey and tearing it. Their toes are long, strong and sharp claws for capturing and holding the prey. They have strong sight to seek out prey, and they are very accurate and lethal in their attacks. So when you look at, for example, an eagle, it has very sharp claws, but at the same time they have very good eyesight. They can see for a very long distance. Imagine eagles fly very far above in the atmosphere, in the skies. They are kings of the skies. But they can see rats that are flying down. They can see chicken down here. And they fly down swiftly and with accuracy. And they can capture your chicken very fast and carry it. And so most of them feed from up there. They take them up, either up in the mountain or up on the tree, and then they feed on them. So that is how those fellows are adapted. Then we have the seed eaters. Yeah, we are talking about the parrots, the sparrows, the chicken at home. Those ones feed on seeds. They are specialized seed eaters. They have usually short beaks for picking up the seeds. You have seen the chicken at home. The upper beak sometimes overlaps. It is hooked like to crack and crush the seeds. For example, if it is eating groundnuts, the upper beak is slightly longer and folded a bit slightly for breaking the shells of seeds and removing the tester and whatever to remove what they want. So they are like that. Their toes are also curved to enable to pick up the seeds. Usually you see them trying to dig the ground using their toes to look for the seeds. So those ones are seed eaters. I want you to remember the examples and also the adaptation they have in terms of their beaks and their toes. Then we have filter feeders. When we talk about filter feeders, we're talking about those that obtain food from water. They obtain particles from water. The ducks, the goose, the shorebill, and the rest. These birds get their food out of the mud or muddy water. They have beaks with serrated edges for sieving out food from the mud. Their beaks have curves. They have some serration near on the edges, so that when the water enters into the mouth, the particles which are solid cannot escape from that beak because of that serrated nature. They have flat webs. They have flat webbed toes on their feet, and this enables them to swim and search for food in water. And the webbed feet also provides a large surface area to walk on mud or muddy water. So you have probably seen the ducks swimming. They swim like boats. They move around water because they have webbed feet, and that enables them to increase surface area to either walk on mud or even swim. You remember that pressure decreases with increase in surface area, so that's exactly what they employ here. Well, those are filter feeders. And then we have woodpeckers, another group of insects called the woodpeckers or insectivorous. You would ask the question, why do they peck the wood? They peck the wood to remove insects. For example, the kingfishers, the swallows, and so on. So this peck, they have quick movements of the beak as it hits or eats something. Insectivorous have sharp chisel-shaped beak used for drilling into trees to pick out insects. So they must have very, very sharp and hard beak and a chisel shaped like a knife used for pecking the wood, to dig into the wood to remove insects that are hidden there. So that is how they are adapted. So their beak is chisel shaped and sharp and hard. Then we have liquid feeders. These ones feed on liquids or fluid food. The sunbird, the hummingbird, and so on. So we have this feed on nectar and in flowers. They have long, slender, pointed beaks used for probing into flowers to suck the nectar. Probably you must have seen these nectar feeding birds, the hummingbird and then the sunbirds. For them, they go into flowers and you see them flying around the flower and inserting their long beak. The beaks are usually very long like a pipe. And then they suck the nectar, and then that's what they feed on. So we have different ways in which birds feed. And of course, I told you the different ways in which organisms feed, especially those belonging to the same class, is one of the methods of reducing competition. Because if they all fed on the same food, the competition will be so stiff, and only a few would survive in that competition. But because of the variation, the diversity in feeding methods, organisms have been able to occupy and colonize different habitats without a lot of competition, with minimal competition. So, in this topic, we have exhausted different methods in which organisms feed, some organisms of our interest. I want to summarize how these different organisms feed. Yes, how the fungi feed, how the protists feed the amoeba, how the birds feed. And when you reach the birds, you look at different birds and summarize how are they adapted, the beaks and the claws and the feet, how are they adapted for feeding. For example, in liquid food, in insects, in flesh, and so on. So you look at that. Then the insects also, how are they adapted to feed on different things, sucking, piercing, and so on. So I want you to make a summary of at least 2 pages, summarizing all mechanisms on how these organisms feed, and then you send me that summary. I'm interested in seeing it so that we see how we progress. Thank you so much for listening and for being attentive. We wish you the best. Please continue staying safe.